I'm Ariel Blumenthal, and I'm here at Hevruta'a, our humble headquarters here in downtown Jerusalem. I wanted to share today a little bit of, let's call it the prophetic history of Hevruta'a, of this building. The story begins really with my own personal testimony. But I came to faith in Tokyo, Japan in 1992. I was 25 years old. I'd grown up in a Reformed Jewish, kind of a secular Jewish home, and was a Buddhist, and had a dramatic encounter with the risen Lord Yeshua in Japan. Immediately after that, I went to live with a group of YWAMers, Youth with a Mission, who were based there in Tokyo, and they were discipling me. They were teaching me how to read the Bible, how to pray. I decided in August 1992, it's sweltering in Tokyo, I was going to take a week of prayer and fasting and read the entire Bible. I had quit my job, and so I had time on my hands, and I began to read. And on either the third or fourth day, I can't remember, I was already in the book of Isaiah. And I came to Isaiah chapter 58, verse 12. And I was reading in English. I really didn't know any Hebrew then. I knew English and Japanese. And when I came to this verse, I kind of had a spiritual experience where the words they grew from like 8-point font to 12-point and became three-dimensional and sort of came off the page like this. Whoa, whoa. And at first I thought, I'd never fasted in my life, not even for Yom Kippur. And I thought, wow, I must be having some kind of hormonal thing because of chemical imbalance in the body, because I haven't eaten for 3 days, only drank water. But I was learning to journal, and they were teaching me, you pray, things happen, you pray, you get impressions from God, you hear from God, certain scriptures speak to you, you write them down in your journal. So I wrote it down, and it goes like this, Isaiah 58:12. Those from among you will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets to dwell in. Okay, here I've been a believer at this time 2 months. I have no idea what this is talking about, but I write it down in my journal, and a few months later I was immersed, baptized there in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Tokyo, and then in October that year I went home to my family's home in West Hartford, Connecticut. And that began a whole chain of events with the family, with the Jewish community, with churches there in the central Connecticut area. And very quickly, the Lord kind of thrust me into ministry. And from 1992 to 1998, I was based there. We started a Messianic Jewish congregation, began to work in a movement called March for Jesus, which was part of a sort of emerging prayer movement in the 90s in the States and all over the world. And every once in a while, I would revisit that verse, and I started to see, oh, this is like my calling, right? In a spiritual way, raising up sort of the ancient ruins of Messianic Jewish faith, which had disappeared for 1800 years. Repairing the breach is an expression of reconciliation. Oh, this was God telling me this is my calling, all in a spiritual way. Growing up, I didn't, as a Jew, Reformed Jew, Israel was on our radar a little bit, but not that much. After I came to faith in 1992 in Tokyo, it was like, boom. Every time I heard something about Israel, or I heard the Hebrew language or Hebrew worship, I would begin to cry. I didn't know why. Something was happening in my heart. Anyway, I moved here in 1998, and for the first 6 months, I was renting a room in a home of some believers here in Jerusalem. And I had in the bank some inheritance money, something from my grandfather that had been invested, not a huge amount of money, but enough to maybe buy an apartment, a small apartment here. And I began to think, why should I pay rent all my life? Better to invest in something. Started looking around. Nothing really, touched my heart that much or gave me any sense of this is it. Until one day someone told me about the Nachlaot neighborhood in downtown Jerusalem. And I went to walk around here one day. And I spent, I think it was probably 5 or 6 hours just walking around this very old for Jerusalem, not the old city, we're in the new city, but it turns out it's the oldest part of the new city from the 1800s, from the time when Jewish people began to come out of the old city and return, and the Zionist movement and say, this is it, it's time to rebuild Jerusalem. it's like this verse from Isaiah 58:12 is resounding in my ears, in my mind, and the Holy Spirit is saying to me, it's not just a spiritual calling, it's concrete. And then it was like in the other ear, I kept on hearing the verses from the end of Acts chapter 2, when it talks about the early community here in Jerusalem, how they shared everything in common, they broke bread from house to house, and the Lord added to their number those who were being saved day by day. And I just knew somehow this is the place that God is calling me to literally rebuild these old places. Because even though this Nachlaot was built up in the 1870s, the 1880s, now it's 140 years later, it had become very run down. There was a lot of problems here in the neighborhood, kind of an inner city neighborhood with a lot of issues. Through Kathy, the real estate agent, we found this place right here at sort of the top of the hill that I could, with the funds that I had, and then with a big loan from the bank, buy and then rebuild. Rebuild meaning, all the homes here were built as one-story buildings with a big arch, and they were made out of very thick stones, not out of concrete back then, like this big, okay? And that's what was here. And then the idea is you take that down, you take most of it down except for one special facade, which is for restoration and history, and then you're allowed to build 2.5 floors. And I took the plunge with the bank, with 2 brothers in the Lord, one a building contractor, the other the architect, and we set out on this adventure in 1999. According to both the builder and the architect, with the funds that I had and from the bank, I had about 90%, 95% of what it was going to take to complete this project. Okay, that's a nice sort of biblical number to believe for 10% God's going to provide at the end, I don't know. And we took the plunge, did all the paperwork and permits and everything. We started in the year in 2000 in the summer. Actually, I was in China. The Lord had begun to speak to me very clearly about China. And I went there in April to start studying Chinese, and Dave, the builder, everything was going smooth. I'm just sending him the money at the right time. I don't know anything about building anyway, and he's going to do it. Well, they started in the summer, and the first few months were just demolition and taking out all these stones and cleaning things up and digging down, and everything was going smoothly until we came to Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, the Jewish New Year, in September 2000. A big thing happened called the Intifada. The second Intifada broke out. Bus bombings and suicide bombings and terrible things happening. Now I'm in China studying, and this suddenly in September, this breaks out. Now Dave, the building contractor, who was a Messianic Jewish guy, like every building contractor in the Jerusalem area at that time, his crew, his workers, came from just past Bethlehem, really near Hebron, and they were well-trained and good workers. I'd been working with him for years. But as soon as all of these bombings began to happen, every time this would happen, the military and the police would close out, would shut down the territories and stop all of these Palestinian workers from coming into the Jerusalem area, because there was just 1 or 2 of them who came in with suicide bombs and blew up buses, and women and children, and terrible things happened. And so the work stopped because there were no workers.